Welcome everyone. My name is Bud Dingus. I'm a cattleman and a veterinarian from Richmond, Texas, and currently serve as chair of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association's Cattle Health and Wellbeing Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you to the NCBA's webinar on the very timely topic, preparing for changing antibiotic regulations. As a participant in tonight's webinar, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the questions box on your screen. At the end of the presentations, questions will be moderated to our presenters by Josh White, part of our NCBA producer education team. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you're joining us for the audio portion, the webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at beefusa.org. With several speakers joining us from across the country, bear with us as we change control of the presentations during the course of the webinar, as there may be a brief pause in the discussion. We have outstanding speakers who will provide the most up-to-date information on antibiotic regulation changes. Our speakers tonight include Dr. Tom Portillo, Manager of Animal Health and Wellbeing for Friona Industries, one of the largest cattle feeding operations in the country. Tom also currently serves as the President of the Academy of Veterinary Consultants. But we'll start our discussion tonight with Dr. Mike Murphy, who is a Veterinary Medical Officer at the FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Murphy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bud. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all this evening. Let me see if I can get my slides set up here. All right. On behalf of Tracy Forfa, the Acting Director, and Bill Flynn, the Deputy Director for Science Policy, I'm pleased to share with you tonight an overview of some of the policy and regulatory changes with respect to medically important antimicrobials in animal agriculture. My hope is to take no more than 25 minutes of your time this evening to kind of give a superficial overlook of the changes that are being made and why, the drugs that are affected and which ones are not, what is a Veterinary Feed Directive, what are key elements of the VFD regulation, and when will this go into effect. And then Dr. Portillo will follow with some more in-depth discussion of the issue. So the changes that are being made with respect to antimicrobial resistance, we all know that this is a complex and multifactorial issue. One of the issues that drives it is use in human medicine, animal medicine, horticultural uses, and other uses. And although this has been a subject of considerable scientific and policy debate for decades, and things continue to evolve, the intent on the part of the agency was to implement measures that would address the public health concern while assuring that animal health needs are met. And I always repeat the while assuring that animal health needs are met part of it. I'm going to mention three guidance documents, 209, 213, and 152. Guidance 209 can be boiled down to two key principles. That is to limit the use of medically important antimicrobial drugs in food-producing animals to those uses that are considered necessary for assuring animal health, that is therapeutic uses, the treatment, control, or prevention of disease in animals, and those that include veterinary oversight or veterinary consultation. Guidance 213 touched on a variety of issues. I'm only going to focus on two of them tonight. One is timeline and one is more clarification of medically important. The first, with respect to timeline, December of 2016, in just a couple of months, is the target for our drug sponsors to implement changes to the use conditions of medically important antibiotics in food and water, to withdraw approved production uses, that is, withdraw increased rate of weight gain or improved feed efficiency. After these changes have been made, then these production uses will no longer be legal. However, the intent is that the therapeutic uses are to be retained, that is the treatment, control, and prevention indications, and in part because the treatment, control, and prevention of disease in animals meets the definition of the practice of veterinary medicine in the United States, we're having a transition to veterinary oversight in the use of these products. The key principles do not require that the veterinarian be involved in actually administering the drug, but rather that the veterinarian authorize the use of the drug, and that authorization is by a licensed veterinarian in the context of a veterinary client-patient relationship. As a practical matter, this means changing the marketing status from over-the-counter to prescription for those products that are administered in medicated drinking water, or to Veterinary Feed Directive status for those products that are used in or on feed, medicated feed. So we've had a lot of questions on which drugs are affected and which ones are not. First, medically important means those antibiotics that are important to use in human medicine, and the dosage forms are those that are administered in or on feed or in drinking water. The other dosage forms, injectables, boluses, and whatnot, are not affected in this transition. As I mentioned, medically important includes those that are considered important for use in humans. We have in the guidance documents reference to, in 213, to the third guidance, guidance 152, that goes into more detail in defining that in a regulatory way. As a practical matter, we've also listed on the website, the Center for Vet Medicine website, and there's a link on this slide 14 of each of the affected applications, and y'all can look there and see what changes have occurred and will occur as in December. I'm not going to go through all 292 of those applications, but just give a brief overview of the antimicrobial classes and some of the specific active pharmaceutical ingredients, the aminoglycosides, lincosamides, macrolides, penicillins, streptogramins, sulfas, tetracyclines, and whatnot, and I'll return to this table a little bit later in the presentation. Although we've spent virtually all of our time talking about the Veterinary Feed Directive, I do want to at least devote one slide to reminding you that also these products that are administered in drinking water are expected to transition from over-the-counter to prescription status. You see Tylosin is underlined there as an example of where the drug sponsor has already made that transition from over-the-counter to prescription use for the water-soluble form of Tylosin. Now, just touching on some drugs that are not affected, we've had a lot of questions. It's a lot of drugs that are not affected, and so this slide is just a distillation of those about which we've received the most questions. It's not comprehensive at all. And it's outlined as antibiotics and other drugs. Those antibiotics that are medically important but are already in Veterinary Feed Directive status, avilamycin, fluorophenocal, tolmicin, and as of this summer, tivalocin, are not affected because they're already in VFD status. And then the other Tylosin and the other water solubles that are already in prescription status, they're not going to be making any changes. Those drugs that are antibiotics but they're not medically important for use in humans are not affected either. Examples of those would be ionophores, limonensin, lasalicids, salinomycins, and whatnot, bacitracin, bambamycin, carbidox. And then the other category is those drugs that are used in medicated feed, but they're not antibiotics. These include the anthelmetics, the beta agonists, coccidiostats. I want to hasten to add on the coccidiostats, these are the non-antibiotic coccidiostats. There are some sulfa drugs that are used to prevent coccidiosis in animals. They are antibiotics. They are impacted by 213. So what's a Veterinary Feed Directive? And I'm going to just jump right to the definition. A Veterinary Feed Directive drug is a drug intended for use in or on an animal feed, which is limited by a Center for Veterinary Medicine approved application, conditional approval or index listing is the ... to use under the professional supervision of a licensed veterinarian. Use of this animal feed bearing or containing a VFD drug must be authorized by a lawful Veterinary Feed Directive. I'm going to define Veterinary Feed Directive first, and then we'll touch on the lawful part a little bit later. The Veterinary Feed Directive is a written, nonverbal statement issued by a licensed veterinarian in the course of that veterinarian's professional practice that orders the use of a VFD drug or a combination VFD drug, and I'll come to that definition a little bit later, in or on an animal feed. This written statement authorizes the client, and I want to emphasize the parentheses here, the client is the owner of the animal or animals or other caretaker. So it authorizes the client to obtain and use animal feed bearing or containing this VFD drug or combination VFD drug to treat the client's animals only in accordance with the conditions for use approved by the Food and Drug Administration. We've had a lot of questions about the voluntary approach that the center took and whether there's going to be any ability to enforce it, and the answer to that is yes, and the enforcement is the regulation, the Veterinary Feed Directive rule, and so I'm going to just give a very brief overview of that rule. In 1996, Congress passed the Animal Drug Availability Act, stating that medicated feeds which require veterinary oversight are VFD drugs. In 2000, CVM promulgated regulations under that rule, and they went into effect in 2001. And as of last year, we updated that regulation, and I'll refer to that as the 2015 VFD rule. But before I do that, I want to touch on something that you're going to see on the labels of these VFD drugs. It says by or on the order of a licensed veterinarian, which is what y'all have been seeing on the labels of prescription drugs for decades. And so as a matter of animal husbandry and veterinary medicine and frankly common sense, you'd think if you'd see by or on the order of a licensed veterinarian on that drug that you'd think it would be a prescription drug. But that's not true as a matter of law. Congress in the Animal Drug Availability Act instructed us at the agency that neither the VFD drug nor the medicated feed containing the VFD drug shall be deemed to be a prescription article by state or federal law. And our understanding of Congress's intent on that was that to create this separate legal category of drug called Veterinary Feed Directive drug so as not to fall under the state Board of Pharmacy authority like the prescription drugs do. So since 1996, we've had a third category of drugs. We now have over-the-counter, prescription, and veterinary feed directive as three separate legal categories of drugs. Here I've mentioned that we updated that rule in 2015, and it went into effect on October 1st of last year, and it's been affecting the VFD drugs that are already in VFD status, the avilamycin, fluorophenocal, and tolmicin. Once these medically important drugs in December transition from over-the-counter to veterinary feed directive marketing status, they'll then fall under the authority of this 2015 VFD rule. By way of example of what we expect to have happen in December is oleandamycin and penicillin are example of two drugs that currently only have production uses on the label. So barring the addition of a therapeutic use between now and December, we would no longer expect to see them in medicated feed. The neomycin, lincomycin, tylosin, virginiamycin, chlortet, and oxytet are italicized because there are some approvals that have production claims only, and those we would expect to be withdrawn entirely. There are other approved applications that have both production claims and therapeutic claims. We expect the production claims to be withdrawn, the therapeutic claims remain, and at that point they transition from over-the-counter to veterinary feed directive marketing status. So some key elements of this VFD regulation, I'm just going to mention that we have some brochures on CVM's website regarding producer, distributor, and veterinary requirements, but Tom's going to go into this in a lot more detail, so I'm not going to take time on it. I'm just going to touch on a few overviews of the rule, and especially where, because some of y'all might have been dealing with VFD drugs before, and where the changes are between the 2001 rule and the 2015 rule. Distributors means any person who distributes a medicated feed containing a VFD drug to another person. Those distributors can either only distribute VFD feed, or they can both manufacture and distribute it. The rule requires a one-time notification to FDA of an intent to distribute VFD feed, and as of the first of this month, we had about 5,000 folks that had notified us, and we're getting several hundred a week. So you can check on our website about any distributors that might be in your area. They're sorted there by state. Category 1 versus Category 2, the 2001 rule automatically said that if you're a VFD drug, you're a Category 2 drug, which means that you would be in a licensed mill. The 2015 rule revised that to eliminate the automatic classification of VFD drugs into Category 2. VFD expiration date, this is a place where we've had a little bit of confusion, so I want to take a minute on it. This is the expiration date of the Veterinary Feed Directive order authorizing the client to obtain and use the medicated feed. This is not the expiration date on the Type A medicated article from which that medicated feed is made. Those are two separate and distinct concepts which unfortunately share the same language or terms. The expiration date will be listed on the product label, and that's true for virtually all the current VFD drugs. If it is not on the label, and that's true for virtually all of the drugs that are transitioning from OTC to VFD, then by rule we said that the VFD expiration date cannot exceed 6 months after the date of issuing the VFD order. The veterinarian can, in his or her medical judgment, make that shorter than 6 months, but not longer. The duration of use is basically the period of time that the animals are ingesting that medicated feed for its therapeutic benefit. And if we get into a situation where the animals are ingesting the feed and the VFD order expires, we've asked the client to contact his or her veterinarian to request a new VFD order so they can continue feeding those animals so they get the therapeutic benefit of the feed. Here is a table of just showing an example of the expiration date of the current VFD ones and the duration of use. This table will get a lot longer as of January of next year. Refills, this is a concept that carries over from prescription drugs. In short, although the VFD rule allows for the possibility of refills, it only allows for them if they're on the label of the approved product. And at this time, their refills are not approved, are not on the label of any of the current VFD drugs or any of the medically important drugs that are transitioning in December. So we don't expect refills to, as a practical matter, to be occurring. We go back to thinking that a VFD order expires and you need a new VFD order rather than refilling it. Approximate number of animals in the 2015 VFD rule, we're asking the veterinarians to work with their producers on the approximate number of animals that are going to get fed, not the approximate number of tons of feed. We appreciate that this is fostering communication between the veterinarians and the folks in the mills to figure out the amount of feed that those animals are going to need. A combination VFD drug is a VFD drug plus another drug. That other drug could be another Veterinary Feed Directive drug, for example, neomycin and oxytetracycline, or that other drug could be an over-the-counter drug, for example, tolmicin and monensin. So as a practical matter, then the veterinarian will be making an affirmation of an intent. That affirmation is, I'm authorizing use of this VFD drug and this VFD drug only, or I'm authorizing use of this VFD drug and all other drugs that the Center for Vet Medicine has approved for use in combination with this VFD drug, or I'm approving use of this VFD drug and certain specific other drugs that I write in or fill in on the VFD order that are approved for use in combination. Examples of that now for the current VFD drugs, there aren't combinations with the exception, and this is one y'all are probably familiar with, tolmicin either alone or tolmicin in combination with monensin. So because of the tolmicin, when you combine it with monensin, that will need to have a VFD order with it. Substitution, this is the notion of substituting a generic drug for a pioneer drug. And I always read these paragraphs to make sure I get the wording right. If the veterinarian does not specify that a substitution is not allowed, the feed manufacturer may use either the approved Pioneer or an approved generic VFD drug to manufacture the VFD feed. However, the feed manufacturer may not substitute a generic VFD drug for a Pioneer VFD drug in a combination VFD feed if the generic VFD drug is not part of an approved combination VFD drug. What does that mean in English? As a practical matter right now, for the current VFD drugs, there is no generic option available except for telmicin for the use of control of swine respiratory disease, but not cattle. Veterinary client-patient relationship, we've had a lot of questions about that early on, and I think we've got those pretty well resolved. The VCPR is the state-defined VCPR unless the state doesn't meet some key elements, in which case the federal definition falls in as default. And as a practical matter, I'm skipped through those slides because here on 47 we've got a link on the CVM website that lists each state and whether the state or the federal VCPR applies in that state. And this is going to be of primary interest to the veterinarians writing the VFD orders. So with respect to the effective dates, I just want to reemphasize that the 2015 VFD rule already went into effect on October 1st of last year. It's been impacting those drugs that are already in VFD status. We're expecting a large number of drugs to transition from over-the-counter to Veterinary Feed Directive status as of December of this year. Once that transition occurs, they'll fall under the authority of the VFD rule. And so we're saying as of January 1st of this year, it's the target for all medically important antimicrobials that are used in or on feed to have a lawful Veterinary Feed Directive order to authorize their use. This presentation has a number of references and web links and whatnot. Those of you that want updates on Twitter or by email, there are ways here on the slide to get them. But with that, I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Portillo for his part of it. Tom, I hope I did that correctly.
It looks like it. And unless I hear any different, I'm going to go ahead and continue on. So certainly Dr. Murphy's presentation was fairly encompassing and detailed. My goal is not to reiterate the information that he passed on to us, but give it to you from my perspective, being a veterinarian and one of those that's going to be charged with authorizing a VFD, and put a little bit of perspective behind that, as well as try to provide some insight and a little bit of recommendation as we go forward with these initiatives. So again, my name is Tom Portillo. I'm a veterinarian, manager of animal health and well-being for Friona Industries, currently in Amarillo, Texas. And again, I'll be going through probably just highlighting some of the information that Dr. Murphy covered and giving my spin on it. So basically, looking at the VFD as it's coming down the line, we're looking at obviously increased oversight, which will be in the form of the VFD requirements. I'm going to cover some responsibilities and challenges as it relates to going forward and using a VFD to allow ourselves to continue to use these feed-through antibiotic technologies. So as we look at increased oversight, as Dr. Murphy pointed out, it limits drugs, the uses in food-producing animals. I want to highlight there at the bottom, it's going to include veterinary oversight and consultation. So everybody understands the oversight. That's pretty obvious. We'll cover that some more. But as it relates to consultation, in my opinion, consultation means, at least to some degree, that's going to necessitate that the veterinarian have at least a part in the design, execution, and monitoring of these health programs wherever a VFD is executed. And in my opinion, that's not unique to the VFD. I think that should be applicable to any drugs that are authorized via prescription as well. But going forward, and with this subject matter, with the VFD, I think that's part of what's going to have to be necessary Depending on how involved and how large the scale of operation is will dictate how much involvement is needed or required by the veterinarian. Again, to reiterate, going through 213, we're going to be requiring some veterinary oversight. So again, to just sum up what Dr. Murphy went through, basically medically important drugs were defined. The production uses or claims on those labels that allow, or production claims for gain, things of that nature, feed efficiency, rate of gains, those are coming off the label. And we are going to increase or implement veterinary oversight as it relates to the uses of these technologies. So it's pretty clear from my standpoint that the emphasis is on oversight. So when we look at oversight, basically I see it three things. You get your veterinary oversight, and underneath that, the VFD, which is part of what we discussed priorly, is the VCPR, Veterinary Client-Patient Relationship. And I think that's going to be the critical portion of the VFD going forward. The VCPR, Veterinary Client-Patient Relationship, prior to the VFD and education programs and comment periods and things of this nature, it was very gray in a lot of states. Some states, the requirements that made up the veterinary client-patient relationship were fairly definitive. In some states, they were pretty vague. And so what the federal government done has gone nationally and said, these are some of the things that are going to be required if we are going to say that there is a veterinary client-patient relationship. And again, in my opinion, it boils down to the veterinarian having a hand in the design and maintenance of the health program of the production facility or producer or client where they're going to execute a veterinary feed directive. As it relates to oversight of the veterinarian, again, just summating some of Dr. Murphy's information, basically my understanding is that as it relates to the practice of veterinary medicine, which involves pretty much the treatment and control and prevention of disease, that's going to fall under the jurisdiction of the State Veterinary Board. As it relates to the execution of the VFD, the order and execution of the VFD, the Veterinary Feed Directive, that's going to fall under the jurisdiction of the FDA. So as we look at the VCPR and some of the things that, some of the requirements or definitions of what makes up a veterinary client-patient relationship, I've highlighted some of the things that catch my eye, where the veterinarian has assumed responsibility for the overall health program. Again, having a hand in the design of that program, knowledge of the production facility, knowledge of the client, their production, philosophies, practices, processes, and timely visits to that operation to maintain sufficient familiarity with individual operations. So again, the veterinarian will provide oversight of treatment, compliance, and outcome, and most importantly, going to have to maintain records as it relates to individual animal health, herd health programs. These are the requirements, again, that are this is the requirements or what's going to be necessary to fill out when on the order and execution of VFD. The three items that I've highlighted: one, the indication for which the VFD is issued, the level of VFD drug in the feed and the duration of use, and then the withdrawal time, special instructions, and cautions. So when we talk about the indication for which the VFD is issued, again, it may sound a little bit like a broken record, but the veterinarian is going to be engaged in the arrival of a diagnosis either directly or indirectly through training and confidence, regular visits, things of that nature. So the veterinarian is going to need to have confidence in the producer's ability to arrive at an appropriate diagnosis prior to executing a VFD. As we go forward, there may be some more opportunity to do this from a distance, because obviously the veterinarian can't be everywhere, so some of this is going to have to happen remotely. The mainstay of that would be, just as I discussed earlier, the veterinarian's confidence in the producer and the producer's ability to arrive at a diagnosis. but as we go forward, as it relates to the monitoring of ongoing health problems, there may be some things we can do at distance digitally with necropsies, things of that nature that we're going to have to try to discover as we go along. So if we talk about the level of drug in the feed and the duration, so the veterinarian is going to be responsible for the inclusion of the drug, how much is going in, the delivery, how it's going to be fed, the duration, how long, and again to reiterate what Dr. Murphy explained, any combinations thereof to make sure those are legal combinations, whether they are over-the-counter drugs or additional VFD, many of those not being legal combinations. So the level of feed and the drug and duration, and so I pulled this off of, I believe, a label of chlorotetracycline. So as we talk about maybe just pneumonia, and you look at the label indications, is it the treatment of pneumonia, which is one dose, or the control of pneumonia, which is another dose? Are we dealing with another disease process, such as anaplasmosis, or the control of the development of liver abscessations, all of which label indications note that there are different dosages based on what the diagnosis or the condition we are attempting to control or treat. So these are things that we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to, or in the past these drugs were over-the-counter, available without authorization, and maybe sometimes it was just one dose that was being used for all disease processes, not necessarily the label dose for the given label indication. Some of the responsibilities and challenges we're going to face going forward, these three things make up what we're going to look at going forward as a producer. Going to have to establish that VCPR, then arrive at a diagnosis, and then follow the label indications. One thing if I'm going to say is if it's not on the label, we can't do it. The VFD is simply an extension of the label, basically. So if it's not on the label, then it's not legal. One of my biggest pieces of advice as a producer is try not to do all three of these at one time if you're looking at the face of some sort of a disease process or outbreak. I would strongly encourage producers to establish a VCPR prior to, because you're going to have a very difficult time executing the VFD if you're starting at item number 1 and trying to establish a VCPR, much less arriving at a diagnosis and following the label indications, which will include finding an appropriate manufacturer who's going to build the feedstuffs for you with the technology or with the antibiotic in it. So we arrive at a diagnosis, that's going to give us the rationale for use, and in my opinion most likely going to become from a distance. So in other words, what is the condition we're treating? And is there a feed-through antibiotic that's legal and appropriate for this condition? Again, we may have some opportunity for some novel approaches as it relates to arriving at a diagnosis, depending on the disease process and the nature and gravity of these diseases. Another thing that we're going to have to come to terms with is understanding and educating ourselves and others as it relates to label indications. There's some long-standing misunderstandings as it relates to feed-through antibiotics as to what they can be used for. When we consider some of the disease processes such as foot rot, pink eye, or just kind of ADR ain't doing right. So when you look at it from this perspective, the perception was that the scope of these technologies was being narrowed, and that's really not the truth. Extra label use of feed-through antibiotics has always been illegal. Some other challenges and questions, not only for those out there listening, but myself as well. For producers, things to think about is, are you going to have access to or feasible access to a veterinarian who can execute that VFD and who's available to establish that VCPR? Is there going to be reliable and feasible access to a feed manufacturer distributor that can make that feedstuffs readily available for you? Maybe the veterinarian and the distributor one and the same. Sometimes we may be limited if we're looking for some access to timely intervention in the face of morbidity, sickness, and impending death, morbidity and mortality. So again, try not to execute all those steps when you run into problems, but start trying to take care of more of those steps before we get into trouble. Another thing, we need to look at the VCPR as more of a partnership. Obviously, the producer is going to see it can see it as a liability or part of an overall investment in veterinary expertise and partnership. The veterinarian can see it as a burden or hardship or part of their overall responsibility as it relates to antibiotic stewardship and animal well-being as well. So if I could offer some advice going forward, make sure we establish that veterinary client-patient relationship prior to January 1. Determine where your distributor will be, where you're going to get those feedstuffs from. And try to figure out as many as logistics as you can before the rule takes full effect. Again, remember that the VFD is the only extension of the label. If it's not on the label, it's not legal. And we're going to have to start, myself included, going to have to start boning up our nutritional expertise as it relates to things like feed types, classes, formulations, combination clearances. Those things are all coming into play for the veterinarian. And the veterinarian is going to have to become an expert in those areas as well if they are going to establish the VCPR with the goal in mind of executing a veterinary feed directive. Again, I would encourage those to begin looking at maybe writing some mock exercises. I have this outbreak. Who am I going to go to get my VFD? Where am I going to go to get the feed? How long is it going to take? Is this going to be a feasible outcome? So that concludes my portion of the presentation. Bear with me while I switch control back over to Josh White.
Thank you to both of our presenters. One of the things the NCBA does best is to bring folks together from across the cattle industry and provide the best information available for cattlemen. I think we've achieved that goal tonight. Please continue to type in your questions, and while Josh is preparing to moderate our question and answer session, I want to remind everyone that this webinar is provided free of charge by the NCBA as a service to the industry. If you are an NCBA member, I want to thank you for your investment in the future. If you're not, we'd love to have you join us in advocating for a profitable future for cattlemen. I also want to make you aware that the NCBA has developed a free antibiotic resource page under the Producer Education tab at beefusa.org. The site features links to producer resources from the BQA program as well as the FDA, and it will include a link to this webinar in a few days. Thank you again for attending tonight's webinar. I'd like to invite all of you to join us at the 2017 Cattle Industry Convention and NCBA Trade Show February 1st through the 3rd in Nashville, Tennessee. Now I'll hand it over to Josh for the question and answer session.
Thanks, Dr. Dinges, and thanks to our presenters. We've got quite a few questions here. Dr. Murphy will start off with one I think is geared toward you. It's fairly specific, and the question is, does pulse dosing, which is common for the feed yard industry of certain drugs, require a separate VFD from your veterinarian, even if it is the pulses are given within a 6-month period?
Right. So my boss, Bill Flynn, and I were at ABP this year and got to work with Tom and Mike Apley and Virginia Fate, and kind of something that came out of that, and I want to attribute it to the ABP folks at a clear way of communicating this, and probably better than I was before, and that is an animal appears on a VFD order only once. So if that animal is going to need to be treated more than one time in that 6-month period of time, you're going to need to think about that being a separate VFD order for that second course of treatment. I don't know, Tom, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well. So every time that you're going to, and depending, I'm assuming when we talk about pulse, we're talking about CTC. Again, look at the label indications. Every time you execute the VFD for something like CTC, it's done. And to feed again, you're going to have to execute another VFD if you're going to feed that technology again.
All right, this is hopefully a simple question for you, Dr. Murphy. Can VFDs be sent electronically?
Sure.
All right. Simple question, simple answer. There's a question here about veterinarian liability. I'm just going to read it. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but maybe you guys do. Is the veterinarian liable for any problems that arise in areas where VCPRs are not as thorough as they need to be? I think that's referring to a state VCPR requirement, so maybe I'll answer this. I guess it would have to meet the federal requirement, correct?
Right. So I'm not sure I completely understand the question either, but I guess I would refer the questioner, and I'm happy to send you a link, Josh. You guys can post it on the NCBA website, but a link to each of the states and whether it's the state VCPR or federal VCPR that applies for each of the states in the U.S. So maybe that'll help them.
Yeah, I have to make sure that that's on our site.
Yeah. My understanding is that individual states can make their requirements more strict, but not more lax than the federal requirements.
That's my understanding as well. Thanks, Tom.
This is another interesting question I think both of you can weigh in on. Obviously, when you're using feed-through, through a VFD, a feed-through antibiotic, it's impossible to determine the exact amount of consumption within a pen per head. So, what is the is there any liability to anyone if an animal overconsumes out of the feed trough when the ration is obviously mixed for the average?
That's a great question. That's a great question. That's one we wrestled with for a long time. Okay, so it goes to the basic question several of us have been asking all along: is are we going to be graded based on the inclusion, which is how much you put in the feed, or the delivery, which is how much each animal eats? Because realistically, when you look at the label indications, it's dang tough to comply with both. So right now, my understanding is that we are going to be held toward the inclusion. We're going to be held, our standard is going to be in making sure that we are using an appropriate inclusion in the feed and not so much what the delivery is to the individuals or the groups of animals based on their individual consumptions or group consumptions. Because if you look at something like Tylosin, feed-through Tylosin for the control of liver abscesses, you may formulate it for one level of consumption, be in compliance, and then you hit the spring, and guess what happens to consumptions? They shoot up, and then pretty soon you're out of compliance. So I'd be interested to hear Dr. Murphy's take on that, but that's kind of my take right now.
So again, I agree that's an excellent question, and for those products that have grams per ton on the label, the gram per ton would go on the VFD order, as Tom has already mentioned, Dr. Portillo has already mentioned. Those that have milligrams per head per day, we have answers out, and AFCO, for example, is one example where you can go to calculate based on the dry matter intake how to convert that into grams per ton and put that in as the level in the feed. As Dr. Portillo mentioned, those that have both gram per ton and milligram per head per day are, we're learning through folks like Tom and others about where that could give rise to some questions, and we may visit with some of the sponsors and see how they're going to think about working with that, and maybe visiting with us to see where those problems will arise. So feel free, I guess this will be a plug for Ask CVM. Some of these questions where we haven't gotten answers out publicly on them yet, feel free to send them in to Ask CVM, ASKCVM at FDA.HHS.gov, and we work those through internally and get them back out, and that's one where maybe we could do that for you.
Great suggestion on getting that question submitted. Another question, got quite a few coming in still. Thank you folks that are still on the line and participating. Please define patient as it relates to the rule. Is that each animal or a lot or a facility? What is a patient?
Patients, they're the animals. Be it one club calf in a backyard or all the animals in a 100,000 head feed yard.
Agree. This is the patient for purposes of the VCPR. I'm assuming is the question. So agreed with what Tom said. Could be an individual, could be a herd, could be a flock.
Very good. We have another question, and I don't think it was covered in your slide, Dr. Murphy, unless I just was looking away, but this one relates to feed-through fly control, the IGR and some of those products that are fed in a mineral supplement that then suppress fly activity in the manure or hatching of eggs, etc. Can you address if any of these new regulations affect that?
It's they do, and it's an excellent question, and we have gotten that one in before and have got a cleared answer here within CBM. And Josh, if you don't mind sending that one in, I'm happy to send you the written answer back for it.
Okay, and
that was one of the stumpers at the AABP.
Yeah.
But you can't respond to it.
Well, sorry. Yeah. So, so what it says, and I'm go with what's in writing and not what I'm doing off the top of my head of what it says. But the veterinarian is not obliged to write the feed-through fly control product on the VFD order. If you want to be sure to authorize it, you could write that into the special instructions part of the order, but you're not obliged to do that.
So if there's no other medication, if there's no regulated medication in the mineral, and that's the only non-mineral additive, there would not be a prescription required?
Correct. Sorry. Good clarification, and thank you. I was speaking for when there was a VFD feed in the medicated feed, or the free choice mineral, in addition to the fly control product. But you're referring to the sole use of the fly control product would, to my knowledge, would not require a VFD order in that situation. Let's get that in to be sure as well, or to get the written answer from it.
Okay, excellent. Another question: what do you do with surplus product that is purchased? Perhaps you have product that you purchased this fall that's left over. I think you may have addressed this, but if you will, just recap that. Or if you receive a VFD product and then for some reason maybe some of those animals are taken off of the prescription and some are not, but you have leftover product.
You want to go? Is that to me or Tom?
I think that one would be to you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Murphy.
Okay. So point one, I guess my understanding is if you have a VFD order, that order could expire without all of the feed authorized by that order from actually being used. If you don't have the occurrence of disease that you thought you were, it's not an obligation to order it, it's merely an authorization to get it. The question is the inverse of that. So you've got the authorization and you've obtained it, but you didn't have to use all of it. So one, to the extent that that feed is a feed that is sufficiently stable that you could still use it in, say, the next 6-month period. If you have a new VFD order, then the first VFD order authorizes you to obtain it, and the second VFD order could authorize you then to use what you've already obtained if you've got another flow of animals coming through.
Excellent. So you could store the feed until you had another VFD order that called for that same, or if it was a raw product, that same ingredient, and then use it later.
Right. Right. That's going to the rule and the regulations will allow that. As a practical matter, if the feed is a type that's going to decompose on you, then you probably wouldn't want to be keeping it very long. And January in Minnesota, that might be different than August in Amarillo or someplace. So the quality of the feed itself may influence how long you'd want to keep it.
All right, sorry, I'm scrolling through these questions. I have one that's fairly, a little bit technical here, but it's from probably a feed yard, I would guess. They have an on-site mixer, so do they need a VFD to buy a bag of what I would call the raw material, the type A drug, such as CTC 50 from a warehouse? They understand that they would need a VFD script to feed the drug, but do they need a VFD to get the raw material to start with?
That one to me too, or Tom, you want to take that one? Or
they will not need a VFD to buy the type A. They will need a VFD to include it in the feed, though.
Agreed.
Sorry, guys, that I didn't delegate there. Another interesting question: if you have a distributor that cannot fill the entire order, can you split a VFD order between distributors, or how would that work? If maybe there was one close by that could fill part of it to get you started, but then he couldn't fill the balance.
For me, that's kind of a tough question. It depends on what drug we're talking about, I think. And so I think they both have to be distributors, with a letter of intent. And as long as they are able to comply with the VFD, I think they both can manufacture the feed, but I'm going to defer to Mike as far as splitting a VFD. That's a new one for me.
Yeah, so agree with what Tom said, that the additional part of that is that the entire amount of feed that's authorized under a VFD order doesn't have to be made in one delivery. So it's possible that, and this gets into a fact-specific thing, so it's hard to give a general answer, but it's possible that, that this first distributor could distribute to them enough feed for what they're going to need for the next, X period of time, and then by the time they need it, for additional animals, that distributor could get new feed, and the problem is solved there. The second permutation of that is whether we have said that, and there are distributors that are under the same, they meet the definition of being the same person under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So they're actually two physical locations, but they can distribute from either location because they are the same, legally the same person. And then thirdly, as Tom was alluding to, if they're two separate, the distributors are two separate legal persons, our preference is really that the VFD order be filled by one distributor. And if you need to go to a separate distributor, probably the preference would be that that be a separate VFD order, unless they're really special circumstances like a fire or something where, they have to do it quickly. I don't know if, hopefully that touches on permutations of the answer, but we probably want to have more specific detail and do that on a kind of a specific case-by-case thing, but those are some general considerations, I guess.
Excellent. Dr. Murphy, I'll let you start this one off, but we've had multiple questions come in around leftover product, that was purchased or that a distributor has in stock before January 1, and then what to do with that after January 1. So could you address the, what the plan is for in-stock product and how that's going to be dealt with?
Right. So I'll start on that, and it it depends a little bit on what we're talking about. But letters were mailed roughly a year ago in the summer to each of the drug sponsors, and then were mailed earlier this summer to retail establishments because I'm assuming the question is getting at there's going to be type A medicated article that still has the OTC labeling on it, or it may have OTC labeling plus what we call transition labeling, saying as of January 1st you're going to need a prescription or a VFD order for it, and then there's going to be VFD labeled product as the type A. What we've said in the letters to the sponsors and to the retail establishments is as of January 1st, a prescription will be needed for those that are in prescription status, and a VFD order will be needed for those that are in VFD status to be used, in other words, fed to the animals, even if the type A that's being used still has the old OTC label on it. You need to have the new B or C VFD label and VFD order to authorize its actual use or feeding. If I'm getting at the question there, Josh.
Yes, I think so, but could you also address that, like the medicated mineral question earlier, if it's a mineral lasts a really long time at a feed store, so if it's a bagged mineral that has not received the new label yet, if it's in stock. Does that make sense?
Right. So you're saying in order for the client or producer to purchase it from the distributor after January 1st, even if it still has an OTC label on it, but the product has the approved product has now made the OTC to VFD transition as of December. Am I clarifying the question?
Right, correct.
Yeah, so I think CVN's position is that the client is still going to need a VFD order in order to purchase that product as of January 1st from the distributor, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yes, I think you are. And Dr. Portillo, maybe you want to weigh in on this first from the veterinarian perspective, and then Dr. Murphy, if you want to discuss other parties such as individuals or distributors. What is the overall record keeping requirement here? So for, as I mentioned, veterinarians, for producers, for distributors, if you guys could just run through the record keeping requirements.
So I think I'm correct in saying that the requirement is going to be that you maintain records for 2 years. That's federally. There are some states that I think, just on conversations, this is anecdotally, may make those requirements, state veterinary boards may make those requirements more stringent. I think most veterinarians kind of, for now, or a lot of them are going into the mindset of going ahead and saving those records for 5 years, because that's just what they do altogether. But I think for 2 years, you're going to have to save your copies of those VFDs.
And so then turning to the clients, producers, and distributors, for purposes of the VFD order itself, that's a 2-year, the federal 2-year record retention requirement as well. As Tom mentioned, I'm not aware of any additional longer period of time that a state may require the distributor or the client producer to retain that VFD order, but that might be a question to just double check at the state level. As Tom said, I think for the veterinarians, the states may require, some states may have a longer record retention requirement. So, but in addition, for the distributors that are also manufacturers, if they're mixing the feed, then there's the record requirements under good manufacturing practice for the medicated feed would apply to them. Those are additional records that are separate from the VFD order itself. My impression is that the length of retention for those records is 1 year, though, for GMP purposes.
And for a producer feeding, what type of detail are you looking for in those records? Or are you just asking that they retain the prescription itself or some record of how that was executed?
So the 2-year period of time would, for the producer, for the client producer, would certainly be for the VFD order itself. Now, if they're mixing their feed on their, if they're an on-farm mixer, for example, then they might, have these other manufacturing purposes records. Am I answering your question or no?
Yes, that's exactly the question. Well, we are over our hour. I will we'll wrap up with one more question. I know there's probably a few we didn't get to, and I will be able to email these to our presenters to try to get answers from those on those as well. Some of them we had duplicate questions, so I'll try and go back. I guess the question that I saw repeated several times tonight, and I'm not sure how deep into an answer we'll get tonight, but is what are the fines or consequences, or what happens if someone does not abide by the new regulations?
The best way that it was described to me is it's eventually I imagine they'll get somewhat more stringent, but I think, and again I'd like to hear Dr. Murphy's take, but I think my impression is that we're going to get some warnings before we get speeding tickets, because the CVM understands that this is a learning process. There's going to be there's going to be some mistakes be made, misunderstandings, things of that nature. But eventually I think the penalties will get more stringent. From a veterinarian standpoint, I don't know about the producers, but from a veterinarian standpoint, the repercussion is the loss of your license to practice. So that's definitely on the line from a state standpoint.
Right. So agreed with Dr. Portillo on his comments, and to reiterate, FDA has said there's a period of education before there's a period of enforcement, and the inspections that have occurred in this year, in 2016, have been educational ones. One comment that I'll add is our head of compliance basically said, though, as we get into 2017, if you have an inspection and it's educational, and then observations are made of suggestions for improvement, and that inspector comes back in a few months or something and nothing has happened, then the next inspection is not educational anymore, because you've gotten your private tutoring. You've gotten your warning ticket already.
Different type of it.
Yeah, so that's just something to keep in mind. But the possible penalties from an FDA standpoint, and I think these are posted on the Farm Foundation website, and these are all going to be fact-specific based on, the facts of the situation, but they allow for what's called a misbranding of the drug or an adulteration of the drug. And if you have misbranding or adulteration of the drug, that could lead to misbranding or adulteration of the feed. FDA has other authorities, civil and criminal penalties and seizures and injunctions and whatnot that are become more severe if things escalate. But those are all tools available to FDA or options available to FDA, but it'd be very fact specific on which of those would be supported in a particular case. I don't know if that helps you, Josh.
That's a satisfactory answer, and I don't know why I ended it on a down note, but anyway, I do thank you both for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Dinges, for your participation as well, and thank you to all of our participants. We will post this up. If you will, as we end the webinar, you will receive a quick survey, 6 questions. I hope you'll take a moment to answer those so that we can make these better every time we do them. And thank you all again. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, Josh.